On the contrary, Carol, thank you. Thank you for this talk. We have a number of comments, all of them very, very interesting.
Great. Well, it's absolutely lovely for me to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to do this session. And thanks to all the participants and all the lovely comments that have been coming in the chat box.
Exactly. I would like to begin with a comment of Higinio Ordóñez saying, Carol is great. It's always a pleasure to listen to her. And actually, Graham also mentioned that you're probably one of the most frequent Be-Built speakers. So your fame precedes you.
Well, I love Be-Built. I've always loved Be-Built. The last time I was there face-to-face was 2020. Just before the pandemic, and it's just wonderful to be back with you all, even though we're online. I give everyone a big virtual hug.
Thank you very much. So if you allow me to take some of one term that we have just learned with Leslie Painter-Farrell, I think that the underlying message in your talk is this asset mindset, working with young learners. Well, I immediately thought success breeds success, right?
Absolutely. No, I thought the same thing when I watched Leslie's session as well. And the asset mindset, I didn't actually use in mine, but you're absolutely right. And I think that's what we're talking about when we look at classroom management through a social and emotional learning lens, because what we are trying to do is to build on all those developmental things that children bring to the classroom in a positive way. So not to see them as, children who they don't know how to behave in a social environment, and therefore, we're going to tell them to stop talking, sit down, be quiet, and so on. We're actually going to look at what they do have and build on that. So very much, yes, a kind of can-do approach.
Exactly. The importance of helping them recognize their emotions and feel free, feel in a safe space to talk about them. Because in my experience, I work mainly with adults, and sometimes they are unable to name them, right? So the advantage that this has, this is real learning for life.
I think it's really important, because as teachers, we're always going to be an authority figure, so that we can get the children to do whatever we want. But actually, the learning involved with that, it's like cutting off their limbs, because if they don't have the experience of trying things out for themselves, they're not going to learn to self-regulate. It was very interesting. I was talking the other day to a colleague of mine who works at secondary level, and she was asking what I was talking about at Be-Built, believe it or not. And so we were talking about self-regulation. And she said to me, Carol, it's so important that we start this early on, because the time I get children in my classes and they're having to learn things like, that actually it's not very good for them to be spending, 5 or 6 hours a day on their screen. And by that time, the teacher, they've got to be able to regulate themselves. Okay, you can confiscate their phones at the beginning of class time, but actually it's only really going to be of value to them if they learn to regulate their own behavior. And I think that is so important. And that is also linked with autonomy, because obviously as teachers of young children in a classroom,
exactly,
we want to be able to give them autonomy. There's a lovely quote by Maria Montessori, who you all will have heard of, the wonderful mainstream educator. And she says something like, children are only as independent as we expect them to be. So, in other words, if we have our classes, absolutely in order and doing what we say all the time, they are controlled, but they're not learning how to be independent, which is so important.
Exactly, exactly. And now that you mentioned that, Carol, I would like to ask you if you could elaborate on the question, on the concept of agency. You know that, incredibly enough, I have not been able to find a precise term in Spanish to talk about student agency. So maybe you could help us elaborating a bit on that concept?
Yeah, I mean, agency, I think, in expressed in a simple way, is having a choice and a voice in decisions and actions. In actually, I mean, it's, you know, children's agency, for example, which is enshrined in the UN Convention on Children's Rights, of having a right to a language, a right to play, a right to express your opinion. And when that's at a kind of macro level, and when you bring that down to a classroom level, we also need to give children choice and a voice in what they do in the classroom. Because if we don't do that, it becomes a vicious circle, and the children are increasingly dependent on the teacher for knowing what to do, how to do it, and for having self-knowledge about their own competencies and worth. So in the preschool classroom, agency may mean very tiny things. It may mean things like, you know, with a collaborative color dictation, that they choose the colors themselves. It may be to do with the activities that they do with the story choice board that I showed you earlier. It may be to do with a project, what they actually make for the project. And usually at this age, it's best for collaborative projects to have every individual producing something for a kind of collective outcome. But this agency goes together with autonomy, because when children, or when anybody has agency, they have ownership of what they do. And if you have ownership of what you do, you feel more committed to it, and therefore you're more likely to carry it out in a more responsible way. So it's a very, very key concept, being able to give children agency. And of course, it is something that in the kind of academic literature is being talked about increasingly. For example, actually giving children a voice in research, so that research is not just done on children, but is done with children.
Oh, wow.
Yes. But on the other hand, everything always starts small, and it has to be in a kindergarten setting, a preschool setting. It has to be within those clear parameters that I talked about actually in the session. Those four, you know, the time, space, activities, that framework that I provided, so that children feel safe, they feel non-threatened, they feel invested in the decisions that they make to do something. So I don't know if that answers your question, if that helps on the idea.
Absolutely. Yeah, of course, it does. We have a very interesting comment from Mariela Masuyama, and taking advantage of your presence, Carol, and your vast experience, she wants to know whether something like a comfort corner would work with older children, say 10-year-olds.
Yeah, I thought that was a very interesting idea. And when I saw the comment, I was immediately thinking about it. I mean, I have to say that myself personally, when I've been working with 10-year-olds, I've never had the luxury of working in the kind of classroom environment where there's space or room to have such a corner. maybe it's the places I've worked in, where there are desks and shelves and that's kind of it. But actually, I think it would be wonderful to be able to have a comfort corner, or a peace corner, it sometimes gets called, somewhere where you can go if you don't feel like joining in, you're upset for any reason, and that would be part of our community space. Again, picking up on one of the things that Leslie was talking about, part of our community space, that everyone else would respect children for going there. I think in that sense, I mean, the kind of corner that I personally, I mean, it's a very personal opinion, this I don't like, and it's never worked for me, is having time out corner,
Exactly.
which is like a punishment corner. Because, very little children, they don't actually have sufficient working memory to really remember why they're there. So very quickly, they feel that they're a victim, that they've been sent to this corner, but they can't really remember why. And so that sort of punishment idea, I feel, is really counterproductive. In fact, I would say stronger than that at this age group. Avoid
at all costs.
At all costs, yeah.
And it goes in line with the concepts with which you began your talk. That would be reactive classroom management as opposed to proactive classroom management, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, although in a way at the beginning, I was polarizing those two types of classroom management, and it's obviously a kind of continuum. And I'm not also saying that there aren't moments, if a child does something that is dangerous or violent to another child, where you do have to intervene immediately. But I tend to feel that kind of reactive classroom management also goes with a kind of classroom where children do what the teacher says all the time. And of course, some learning takes place, probably more sort of formal linguistic learning. But the point is, the children aren't learning they aren't learning themselves. They aren't having this kind of internalization. They aren't developing as people. And that's why probably with a proactive approach, you more associate it with a whole child approach to children's English language learning and their development, where all the time you're taking account of their psychological, emotional, social, creative, physical development. You're seeing the child in the round. And actually, in my experience, I think that if we work with children in that kind of way, rather than hammering away at, I have 6 vocabulary items a lesson, for example, that we want them to remember, actually, the outcome is that we're more successful and effective in our work. And certainly, what is absolutely crucial is laying the foundations for future learning. Because if children in preschool get the idea they don't like English and it's just, no, they can't cope with it, if they feel like that in preschool, what is going to happen in primary school, never mind secondary? We're going to shut down. So the really important thing is for children to feel this affect towards English and the can do. They want to participate and they can participate, because, to build on something else I mentioned in my session, you're using formats in Jerome Bruner's terms. So you are, you're repeating these contextualized scenes. You do the same routine every day. Hello, children, how are you? I'm fine, how are you? And it becomes so internalized
Exactly.
that it leads to autonomy. So,
exactly. Yeah, and the same thing happens with a language. For example, the language for cooperation that they learn. There was a comment on whether you could teach us the tune of the other two songs.
Oh yeah, actually, I saw that. Luckily, because I have no voice at the moment, those are actually rhymes, which is why I didn't sing them. The ones I sang were the ones so that you would know the song. So they were just rhymes. I have to say, I just take any old song I know, any traditional song, put my own words to it. And I always feel a bit self-conscious in front of a children. I'm very happy about it.
Thank you very much. We have a comment by Main Rodriguez. She actually mentioned that she was feeling a young learner herself, a child herself, that she was having these very young learners in a private academy, and that it has been a challenge because children are wiser than we think. But once they learn to take responsibility for their own learning, the whole process gets better and better. So she has experienced, in paraphrasing her comment, what you are saying. The more we use these principles, the more children will remember and internalize them, right? She also mentions that she appreciates your suggestions of having parents involved. Would you like to give us a few more pointers on that?
That's lots of things. I'd like to say one thing first. I will talk about parents, but as you were speaking, it was reminding me of another quotation from that Chaim Ginott that I mentioned, which I always find is really compelling, because he says, how do we go about changing a child? Thinking in behavioural terms. And he says that the answer is very simple and at the same time very complex. And he says that the way to do it is to treat children as if they are already the people we would like them to become.
Oh, that's lovely.
Now, that is very, very powerful. And it's all to do with expectations, of course. And it's, because sometimes when we were talking about reactive classroom management, sometimes people think, these young children, they're too immature, they don't know enough English, they won't behave. So we can't do any of that. But actually, if you start treating your 5-year-olds as if they're ready to go to university, I mean, I'm slightly exaggerating, but
it is clear. Yeah.
The effect is amazing. Actually, it's a very powerful thing. But what the comment raised so many interesting things, because I think actually, the comment about learning and feeling like a child and enjoying it during my session, actually that comment is valid for all learning and our learning as adults.
Absolutely.
I mean, we feel like that whatever we're learning. If we're not enjoying it, we quickly switch off and look at our phones or do something else. So I think
absolutely, just wander in our mind.
Well, and the third thing, sorry, are we out of time?
No, please go ahead.
No, the third thing that you mentioned, and I didn't answer immediately, was the importance of parents and the relationship of parents and taking things home to parents. And because a very powerful thing, if, for example, you take a little picture book of the story you heard and you take it home and you tell the story to your parents, and it doesn't matter, you might tell it in English, you might tell it in Spanish, or you might teach your parents. But we know from, it's Einstein, I think he said it, how powerful it is when you teach something to someone else. And if you have that really good relationship with parents, and as teachers, you send home information about what you're doing, guidelines about what you and your child can do together. And even if you don't speak English at all as a parent, you can still, get your child to teach you. And through the process of the child teaching you, of course, they are revisiting it in their heads and internalizing it. And I think that relationship, that it's really a triangle between parents, teachers, and children that is so powerful in the kind of outcomes that we're going to get. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Carol, for this really insightful and wonderfully practical talk. I am sure that our teachers in the audience will be using these activities and quoting you as of next Monday. Remember that you can find out more about Carol on her website, www.carolreed.com. You will find there information on all her publications and talks with very useful resources, videos on her talks, workshops, and interviews. So please join me again in thanking her by giving her a big round of virtual applause.
Thank you so much. It's been really, really lovely to be here with you all, and thank you for all the wonderful participation, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Please accept our sincere gratitude for this talk and your contribution. Always fantastic to the conference.
Thank you so much for having me. Okay. Bye. Bye.
Bye.